The Natural Man podcast is intended as general information for educational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice or a diagnosis of any kind or as a substitute for medical treatment. The information provided in this podcast is not meant to replace the advice of or treatment by any physician. Do not rely upon any information to replace consultations or advice received by qualified health professionals regarding your own specific situation. If you suspect that you have a medical problem, you are urged to seek competent medical help. The Natural Man podcast and its representatives and agents disclaim any liability for any negative or other medical or other outcomes that may occur as a result of acting on or not acting on any information contained in the podcast. The views and opinions expressed by the host and all guests are their own, and their appearance on this podcast and at the website of the Natural Man podcast does not imply any endorsement of them or any entity they represent and does not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the Natural Man podcast. This is the Natural Man podcast. Get ready for showtime. Julia Ross, thank you so much for being here for another episode. I'm so excited. You're a best-selling author. You're a nutrient therapy pioneer. You are a guru with amino acids because we learned that in our last episode when you were so graciously made time to hang out with us. You're a world leader in the use of nutritional therapy for the treatment of mood problems, eating disorders, and addictions. And I want to get into that today. You've worked for decades tailoring programs for people to get over unhealthy food addictions. And we've had you on before. You shared your innovative strategies for battling insomnia, which many people have found very effective. So tell me, Julia, how did you get into this work?
Well, which work are you talking about?
Well, just the counseling in general, just helping people overcome addictions, helping people sleep better. You've been helping people in different ways for a long time.
Well, that's the reason I ask is that I've been helping quite a number of people with different problems and
right.
Over the years. But I actually started helping people as a licensed psychotherapist here in California, and actually I was finishing up my master's degree and ran out of my student loan and needed to get an internship that paid, and there was only one available, and that was in the addiction field, which I really didn't want to get into. Not that I knew anything about it, but it just sounded depressing, I remember thinking. But I took it. I took the job and absolutely fell in love with the whole field of addiction recovery, and at that time there was a tremendous amount of openness in terms of experimenting with different approaches, mostly psychotherapeutic, on top of the 12-step model, which had been there for a long time already. We're talking about the late 70s. So that all went very well for several years, and I became a very seasoned therapist, loved the work, our clients loved us. We could hardly go home after the groups, we wanted to go on and on. It was very exciting, and then the relapse statistics started coming in, and we found that we had what we considered to be a pathetic 50% success rate, and began to scramble to find even better techniques to get even better success rates for our clients. And that was just launching when the crack cocaine epidemic started in the 80s, early 80s, and suddenly our success rate was zero. And this was the case all across the country.
Are you saying this was because of the cocaine era?
Yes, cocaine was just a more addictive substance than anybody in the addiction field had ever seen.
Wow.
And we just had no tools.
Yeah.
They checked in, they checked us out, and they disappeared. And that was true all across the country. So really, all of us in the addiction treatment field went into kind of a depression because we couldn't help anybody. Most of our clients now were crack cocaine addicts, and we couldn't help them. And then we were fortunate enough to learn about neuroscience from neuroscientists themselves who were specializing in the addiction and the brain connection. And they explained to us that our techniques were great, that we were really on the cutting edge, actually, but that we weren't addressing the primary problem with addiction, and that was neurotransmitter deficiency. And they explained to us that, the brain could generate pleasure in a myriad of ways if it was functioning properly, but that addictive substances, alcohol, drugs, and some years later we learned food, especially the kinds of foods that are being produced now in the junk food industry, all interfered with that neurotransmitter function, and as a result created really unbearable cravings, and therefore were highly addictive. And without tools to get into that brain and restore normal brain chemistry, we were all trapped.
Yeah. So how did cocaine take over the addiction world? Like, were there still alcoholics? Were there still other drugs that were in use, street drugs at that time, or did cocaine just hijack everything? Was marijuana still being used regularly by people?
Oh yes, but by that time, the insurance industry was refusing to pay for inpatient treatment, and so the addiction field started developing intensive outpatient programs, which were equally effective, and so the alcohol and the marijuana addicts were funneled into outpatient, and it was only the cocaine addicts that didn't respond at all to outpatient, who were, left to our, who were our responsibility.
Yeah.
As residential programs, and so that's why I was in trouble. I happened to also have an adolescent program up and running in 3 counties by this time, and that was doing well because all those kids were addicted to marijuana, and we were able to help them and their families beautifully. In fact, we had an 80% success rate, but crack cocaine was a whole new world, and none of those tools really were helpful.
So prior to the neuroscience discoveries, the neurotransmitter science and the use of those, cocaine was just a cocaine addiction was untreatable. Is that what you're saying?
Well, crack cocaine addiction.
Okay.
Specifically. Cocaine had been around. We were seeing it, but we were able to deal with it fairly well. It was the crack that put it over the top, but made it an unreachable addiction. And it's still considered the same today.
Really?
Yes.
Now, why is it the same today with all the innovation and research that has been done in those decades, do you think?
Well, the addiction treatment doesn't, conventional addiction treatment doesn't work for anyone. But crack cocaine, again, is, the least responsive. So mostly the addiction treatment field has been innovative in the sense of trying to introduce drugs that will help people to withdraw and tolerate life without their drugs, because there are new pharmaceutical drugs. And you can imagine how successful that strategy has been.
Yeah. And why was outpatient such a failure? Is it just because they couldn't keep people in a longer duration to get them off these substances? What do you think of that?
Well, it just wasn't intensive enough. They had to be in protective custody, in a place where they didn't have access, that in an outpatient, you're going to work, you're going to school, and you have treatment at night, or, and you have access to all your friends and all your connections and so forth. So
Yeah.
that was the problem. But I really think we should move on to a happier topic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is very interesting, but yeah, definitely. So our original topic was, the craving cure and the role of neurotransmitters in controlling food cravings. Can you elaborate on that approach for us? I mean, I think that's a good bridge from where we started because it all involves neurotransmitters. Am I right?
That's right. And all addictions respond to neurotransmitter restoration. But it turns out that the most deadly addiction and the most widespread addiction in this country and worldwide is food addiction, addiction to drug-like foods. And so the advantage of working with this group is that it tends to be more stable. You can still work, go to school and so forth, and eat Twinkies all day.
Yeah.
So on the other hand, the long-term death rate is very high, from diabetes primarily, but also from non-alcoholic liver disease, some of the other conditions that are directly attributable to junk food.
Right.
So given that, we have a population that's more stable, and given the fact that we learned in the late 1980s how to restore normal neurotransmitter function nutritionally and very rapidly, we have been enjoying tremendous success with food cravings specifically.
So if neurotransmitters become out of balance, how does that process start? I mean, are the people already addictive to nutrient-depleted foods, or is there just an amino acid deficiency not to make enough neurotransmitters? Where does this begin?
Well, there's probably, some genetic vulnerability that's inherited. We have quite a number of clients, for whom alcoholism, at least in their family tree, has been a factor. And that's always been true for as long as I've been working with food addiction. But the fact is now that anybody can get addicted. Doesn't matter whether they have genetic problems or not, because the industry that's producing these edible narcotics has been so successful. There's a lot of money put into what they call food science, which is, how to addict the customers more effectively. And you might be interested to know, and your audience might be interested to know, that the snack food industry was bought up by the tobacco industry in the 60s and 70s as tobacco was becoming, a dubious enterprise, with so many lawsuits and entire states suing the tobacco industry. I've forgotten how many $1 billion they paid out, when it was proven that they knew their stuff was addictive and deadly and so forth. So that has yet to happen with food. They are operating in plain sight as, the most successful drug purveyors of all time.
Yeah, and in your book, you make a point that food cravings are only a few decades old, that prior to that time period, they didn't exist. So can you elaborate on why that is?
Well, let's just take some historical perspective. We were eating and enjoying our eating in, tens of thousands of different cuisines worldwide, all of them essentially composed of healthful foods. Over the decades, and well, actually, sugar became an issue, really became an issue starting, in the early 1900s when we had more access, more money, bigger sugar industry. But even so, it was pretty much limited to desserts, after a healthful meal, where you really weren't so tempted, to go all out. And our desserts were homemade, and they included a lot of healthful foods, typically lots of eggs and cream and, healthful fruit, nuts, at any rate.
Yeah, no preservatives.
Right, no preservatives. Yeah. And we were using the original traditional form of sugar called sucrose. So sucrose is not as addictive. Why? Primarily because it's composed of two forms of sugar, glucose, which the body has to have in order to run all of its trillions of cells, and fructose, which is not needed. It, presumably could be handy, and it certainly exists in fruit, because it eventually converts into glucose, but it was never intended to be a primary fuel for the human body. And in the 70s, they learned how to cleave the bonds between the glucose and the fructose so that they could control how much fructose and how much glucose was contained in a given food. And the reason that this was so helpful to the food industry was that fructose is about 10 times more addictive than glucose. And so the caffeinated soda industry, were the first to benefit from this by using high fructose corn syrup in Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and so forth. So that was one of the big factors in the 70s that broke through our, very heavily programmed appetite chemistry. I mean, the number of factors involved in what they call satiety, for us to instinctively know which foods to eat, how much, when is enough to stop, and so forth. Very carefully, very successfully programmed over millions of years. And suddenly, we're losing track of it. And so I would say that's the primary thing that happened in the 70s, but there were many other things that happened in the 70s. I have a whole chapter in the Craving Cure on what happened in the 70s that threw us entirely off track and into our current almost apocalyptic.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. And you mentioned fructose, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the use of fructose is that it bypasses that mechanism in your brain that tells you you're full. Is that accurate, or do I have that wrong?
Well, not so much in the brain, but there are other mechanisms in the body. Insulin, for one, doesn't recognize that it even exists. The insulin producing, the pancreas, basically, doesn't recognize it. It just doesn't have a mechanism to address it. So that's why we take it in, and it all goes to the liver. The liver is trying to process it. It's a foreign, toxic substance. And that's why we have an epidemic of non-alcoholic liver disease now. It's because of the amount of fructose that the liver, is trying to, and unsuccessful in fully dealing with.
Yeah, and does fructose, does it spike your blood sugar the same way? Does it affect blood sugar levels because the insulin receptors don't see it? How does it
Uh,
impact blood sugar?
it doesn't affect the blood sugar initially, but when it converts into glucose, then you have this sort of delayed um, high blood sugar situation.
What's the process like for somebody who enters your program? Do they, I'm talking about the food craving program, do they stop all processed foods cold turkey? Is there a weaning process? How do you approach that when somebody comes in brand
Oh,
new?
we absolutely tell them they can't stop.
They cannot stop?
No, we don't want you
Wow.
to stop
Okay.
until we are clear what are the nutrients that are going to make stopping easy.
Oh,
We are
wow.
not going to be another torture chamber for, you know, addicted people who, by definition, can't stop.
Yeah.
That is the definition of addiction. You know, it's an involuntary activity that's much stronger than willpower. So until we have the tools at hand, which doesn't take very long, but it really is so refreshing for people to be told that they can't start eating healthy
I
food
was just
yet.
going to say that's less daunting. It's like, oh, I can still eat what I love until we fix it the other way. I mean,
Right.
that's fantastic, Julia.
Well, it's it takes a lot of the strain off of what would ordinarily be a pretty stressful early. I remember working with drug addiction. We didn't have these tools then either. And we were just working so hard to help them do something that was really not doable, and blaming them at the time, not understanding what they were up against,
Yeah.
for not doing a better job of letting go of it with our wonderful help.
Yeah.
So now we really do have wonderful help, and so we just need to see people. So now we're an entirely virtual clinic, and we arrange for a quick intake that people fill out some forms so that we can get a very quick but thorough idea of what's going on with them, and then we schedule what's called an amino trialing session where we use the symptoms from their intake forms to help us very quickly identify which of the 5 areas of the brain are malfunctioning. And we know now which nutrients will repair each one of those 5 systems. And so appetite control systems. And some people just have one, but that's unusual. Most people have at least 2, and it's not at all unusual for people to have all 5 of their appetite, control systems malfunctioning.
Yeah. And so what's the most common amino acid that is there a most common one? Are they all different for different people? What's the
Well,
go-to?
after the craving cure came out, we were able to get a better handle on that. And what we have found is that the most common, during COVID, it was a neck and neck between the calming neurotransmitter and the pleasure producing, pain killing neurotransmitter endorphin.
Hmm.
Um, and but over time we've seen that in fact what we call the comfort craver, who is deficient in endorphin, is the most common type. They are eating for comfort, literally, and of emotional pain uh, and discomfort, a sense of sadness and hurt and loneliness, regardless of their life circumstances. Um, and those are the people who find that chocolate, especially, which is probably the most successful endorphin booster
Oh man,
drug.
I'm feeling convicted because that's me.
Uh-huh. Well, you're not alone. In fact, when I was researching the craving cure, there was some panic about whether the supply of chocolate was going to be adequate worldwide for the demand,
No kidding. Wow.
which increases every year as the addictiveness of the substances
Yeah.
added to chocolate increase in potency.
So what you're telling me is I need to enroll.
Uh, well, you could enroll, or you could get the mood cure and confirm, your guess by taking the questionnaire, which is online.
Right.
Also, as well as being in the book. And then you could go directly to the two chapters in the middle of the book that are how to tailor an amino acid therapy program to your own brain. And experiment. And apparently a lot of people do that. If you go, at the Amazon book reviews, you'll find a lot of people raving about the success of this strategy and that they were able to figure out for themselves. So the fact that most food addicts are low in endorphin is a good example of how easy this is to fix. But there are also, as I said, the stressed cravers who are eating to try and relax and ease the stress. There's also the depressed craver, the anxious craver, low in serotonin, our natural antidepressant, anti-anxiety, natural neurotransmitter. Again, easy to correct with a simple nutrient.
Wow.
So, and it goes on, the second most common is the hypoglycemic eater who's, we also call him the crash craver, who, is drawn to sugar, coffee, things that raise glucose levels and give you a high. And then there's a crash because the pancreas produces the insulin to drag all this excessive sugar out of the bloodstream, and suddenly there's not enough.
Yeah.
And there you go again, with your favorite chocolate or whatever. So that's another one that one of these marvelous amino acids can take care of almost instantly. And I've left one out, and that's probably the least common deficiency for a food craver to have, and that's what we call them the fatigued craver. They're low in their stimulating neurotransmitters, so they're more likely to be interested in something caffeinated, so soda addicts. Starbucks addicts and so forth.
That's that person that has like 10 sodas a day, because I've met people like that.
Right, and it doesn't matter whether it's actually calorically sweetened or non-calorie sweetened. The same kinds of brain changes occur.
Is there ever a time where your approach doesn't succeed? Do people give up? Do they find it difficult? Like, what's the success rate?
Well, it's about 90%.
Wow, that's impressive.
And even the people, the 10%, I mean, it's almost unheard of not to get any benefit. So even the 10% are improved, but there may be another issue. But frankly, it's so unusual that, my nutritionists don't even report them. We actually had to do a formal, count to identify how many of them there might be. So yeah, this is, part of it, something important to say here that, may never have been said, certainly on the internet, but I just said it in an article that I wrote in Women's Voice. Some people might be interested in their May edition. And that is that amino acids are strangely enough, the most potent of all nutrients as individual supplements. And by their nature, they have myriad possible benefits.
Yeah.
Predictable benefits. Really, our whole system is made out of amino acids, made out of protein. If we just, consumed fat and water and sugar, which is either burned or converted into fat, we would just be sort of a puddle. But it's the protein, it's the 20 amino acids that create all of this incredible diversity of cellular function. So they are miraculously potent, potentially miraculously potent in a number of ways. And we're very fortunate that neuroscience identified, and this is actually common knowledge in any of the fields that study cellular chemistry in the body, that these powerful neurotransmitters and our blood glucose regulator, all of them are fueled by each one is fueled by a single amino acid.
Wow.
And that means that it's an ideal problem to deal with nutritional supplementation, because you don't need 12 different supplements to raise serotonin or lift endorphin levels. You really, really do just need the right amino acid.
Right. And so functional medicine docs often tell people to find a protein supplement that has a good balance of all the amino acids. So I don't do protein supplements myself. I just consume a lot of protein, in the form of, fish and meats and whatnot. If somebody's regularly taking one of these protein shakes with the full amino acid profile, the good balance of all of them, can they avoid these issues if they're getting those amino acids from a good supplement, protein supplement?
Well, if they can digest them, but most of our clients, the food they've been eating has compromised their digestion, like decades before they reach us.
Right.
So that's one issue. But the other issue is that there are almost no protein powders that do have an appropriate array of amino acid contents.
Is that right?
The only one is whey.
Huh.
You can get free form amino supplements. I helped to design the one that I think is the best. It's called Total Amino Solutions. I don't own it. I don't make any profit from it, but I helped design it. And that people can feel right away, partially because it's free form. It's not food. In food, all of the amino acids are bound together, so you really have to be able to digest in order to break the bonds and utilize the amino acids. But plant proteins just don't have very many amino acids in any appreciable amount. They'll have a few that there's plenty of, but then so many of them don't have any tryptophan, which is our natural antidepressant. And in fact, the bodybuilders are reporting high rates of depression because they're so dependent on branch chain amino acids, which are very, they're only like 3 or 4 aminos in that. And they've created this imbalance, even though they tend to eat a lot of protein. This imbalance is created especially because there's no tryptophan in branch chain aminos. So protein powders are a problem, except for people who do well with whey. So unfortunately there are a lot of people who don't do well with dairy proteins, but a lot of people do better with whey, for example, than casein, the other protein in dairy products. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, absolutely. No, definitely,
Okay.
definitely. Thank you. And another thing I was going to ask you was, there's a wide variety of people, different kinds of people who have food cravings. Why is it that some put on a lot of weight and some don't. I know people who are, thin as a rail and they have food cravings. So where's the difference there?
Well, again, we've got genetics, and but there are other big issues. And as in all addictions, there are degrees. Some people are addicted to chocolate, but they have 4 squares of chocolate every afternoon.
Yeah.
They can't do without, but it's not hurting them.
I feel like you have a camera on my house now by you saying that.
Well, I'm going to ask you the embarrassing question. How much chocolate do you need in a day?
I mean, I purposely don't do it every day, so I do it every other day. But I'll have like one, I don't measure the amount, but like I'll have a chocolate bar sized. Does that make sense? Yeah, so a full bar, not a big bar, just an average sized chocolate bar.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So you're on the low end of the addiction scale.
Okay. That sounds fair.
Yeah, because there are people who eat, 10 or 20 or the equivalent every day.
Oh, I couldn't do that.
Okay, well, that's why you're not obese.
Okay.
Or at least that's one reason.
Yeah.
So here's the other thing that's so tragic is that people who develop these brain neurotransmitter deficiencies and lose control of their intake of high-calorie, nutrient-void foods become desperate. And this is another thing that's actually started in the 60s. We started to experiment with low-calorie dieting. And it's still the only thing people know to try. If I'm eating too much, the solution is to not eat any. But there's a problem with that. There are lots of problems with that. People are already malnourished because junk food just doesn't have nutrients in it except for calories. And then they switch to not having any food or very, very little. And one of the first things that happens when you cut your calories way back is that the thyroid turns down. And the thyroid is really in control of calorie burning.
So you become hypothyroid when you stop that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an automatic survival mechanism because, the body is really only familiar with phenomena like famine. And during a famine, you have to conserve as much as possible. You don't want to burn because, you disappear. So the thyroid turns down, and some people are more efficient at turning down their thyroids than others, and some of them are less efficient at turning it back on when they start eating. And so there's, too many calories versus not enough calories accounts for an awful lot of obesity.
Wow. This is probably a stupid question at this point, but I guess it's safe to say that every food craving has an emotional component. There is no other reason for that.
Well, I think probably it's important to get some perspective on what exactly do these neurotransmitters do. They don't just regulate our appetites. They also regulate our moods.
Right.
So if we are deficient, we are going to have appetite problems and mood problems. Some people just have mood problems, but that's unusual. I mean, we never see an overeater who doesn't have some mood problems. So that's part of the tragedy of neurotransmitter deficiency is that it targets our moods as well as our appetite. So our physical health and our mental health, suffer so much, and now we're seeing both at all ages.
And do you ever see a correlation between addictive behaviors in that are people with food cravings more susceptible to doing, a drug addiction or alcoholism or anything like that? Do you see overlap there ever, or are they different?
Well, if there's a family history of alcoholism or some sort of addiction, then it can go either way. Like the children of alcoholics either become alcoholic or they become food addicts typically. But that the alcohol is just one of the possibilities now.
Right.
With pot being so potent and
Yeah.
so many street drugs available. But that vulnerability, not making adequate neurotransmitters, that can be, inborn. We all know that we have our own vulnerabilities. When I was growing up, I would visit my friends' houses, meet their parents, and I was surprised to find, that some of them were grouchy and some of them were jolly and some of them were really quiet, and I could see that they were born that way, and they would even talk about it. Oh yeah, my parents were real quiet too,
Yeah.
So there, we all have, personalities that are affected by our neurotransmitter function, the inherited neurotransmitter function. So that's a lot of what the connection is. And one of the things that I should tell you is when we started working with cocaine addicts, not the crack addicts, but the cocaine addicts who would actually stick in our programs, they would all gain 30 pounds in 30 days.
Really?
Yes, every single one of them.
Now, why is that?
Clockwork. And it happened right away. And because they were using the drug sugar to try and stay away from the drug cocaine.
Oh, okay. So one replaced another. Yeah.
What?
So one replaced another.
Right. Coffee and sugar. It wasn't a perfect solution, but they got enough boost. The drug-like boost from the sugar and coffee to hang on. That, and a lot of people talk about how they relapse, and that junk food is a big part of it. I remember one recovering alcoholic who spoke at a monthly meeting of family and graduates of a treatment program, and he'd been out for a few months, and he said it was real clear to him that part of being inpatient was that he had 3 meals a day. He could only have decaf coffee, and he started feeling better, physically better and mentally than he'd felt in a really long time. But when he got out, they wanted him to do 90 and 90, which means going to an AA meeting every day for 90 days. And that meant he didn't have time to work and eat properly. And he could feel himself going downhill.
Wow.
So that food creates this, or perpetuates the deficiency. The junk food perpetuates the neurotransmitter deficiencies that caused the addiction, to take hold in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's part of the reason that the drug treatment programs report 90 to 100% relapse.
They're just not looking at the neurotransmitter side of it.
No, and they're not looking at diet as an addictive drug.
Now, you're an expert in treating sleep issues. We spent an hour talking about that last time you were here,
Right.
which I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that. You have such a unique approach, and I've already told you I'm a fan of your work. I'm going to say it again. Amazing work in sleep medicine you've done.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Now, Do the people who deal with these addictions ever also have sleep issues, because this is all neurotransmitter related? Do you notice that? Do you ever have to tackle insomnia along with addictions in the same patients?
Oh, sure. There are. I I don't know. I think the statistics show that the majority of adults suffer some degree of insomnia in the United States. Um, so we don't find it any more common among addicted people than non-addicted people. But again, it's pretty easy to identify what the cause is, and quite often, it's related to their cravings. So,
Right.
for example, if they have the depressed and anxious, low serotonin kind of cravings that certain foods will relieve temporarily, they're very likely also to have a type of insomnia that's caused by serotonin deficiency, because most people don't know this, but serotonin, our sunshine, antidepressant neurotransmitter, converts as the day goes on and gets darker as the sun drops. The serotonin converts into melatonin.
Right.
So if you don't have enough serotonin anyway, you're not going to have enough melatonin. And sometimes just by giving them the amino acid that so quickly raises their serotonin levels, then they start converting to melatonin, and the sleep issue is solved along with the mood and craving issues.
Yeah, tryptophan is probably the most potent sleep aid I've ever needed to reach for if I'm restless on a particular night, which thankfully is not common. But yeah, tryptophan is it. That's one of my favorite go-tos for sleep.
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work for everybody. That's why we talked about insomnia for an hour. But among the amino acids, it is definitely the most successful strategy. But then we have our stressed cravers, and oftentimes they're not getting to sleep because of stress. They're worrying.
Right.
They're their adrenaline is high at the wrong time, and so they're eating over it. And when we give them a supplement called GABA, their natural ability to relax increases, because GABA is our relaxing neurotransmitter, and so then they can sleep better.
Yeah.
So it really, whatever is going to work for them depends on their chemistry. And then we have other sleep strategies too, if those don't work.
Yeah. It's amazing what's available out there on the nutritional front for sleep issues. I think a lot of people don't know the different things that are available. And you touch on so many of them in your program, and I think it's awesome. I mean, that's why we wanted to get the word out, and that's why we had you on to talk about insomnia.
Well, we have the program for cravers and what we call false moods, people with false moods, but we have a separate program for people who really just have the insomnia, and those people have usually looked around a lot, before they get to us. So we don't bother going back over the ground they've already covered, but we'll move them through the other things that we know pretty fast.
Right.
And enjoy working with them, because usually we can help them.
Yeah. Do you think that we could avoid all these issues, cravings, sleep, if we all just stuck to a more ancestral diet?
Oh, no question. Although we're so depleted now, that we typically need supplements for a while to restore levels. But yeah, there's no question. It's just that people can't, because they're too addicted to the non-ancestral diet.
Yeah.
Which is addictive. The ancestral diet is not. It can't compete with Skittles and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Julia, this has been fun. Julia Ross, juliarosscures.com is the website. That's where they can get more information on your book and your programs. Is that right?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we put that in the show notes. And
thank you.
You know what? You're such a great guest. I say that a lot. I'm blessed with the amazing people that come on here. I hope you'll come back and hang out with us.
I'd love to. You are one of my all-time favorite interviewers.
Oh, awesome. Well, now you're making me blush.
Too bad it's just audio.
Well, thank you, Julia, for being here, and we really appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again. So thanks for making the time.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
That'll do it for this edition of the Natural Man Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to us. Check out our website, naturalmanpodcast.com, and download us wherever you listen to your podcasts. And make sure you subscribe. Until next time, I'm Mike C. Stay healthy. The Natural Man Podcast. Check us out, naturalmanpodcast.com.